Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Talent Table event. And I'm so glad that we are getting together in person again. I'm not there in person. I wish I was. And maybe next year that might be a different story. And this session, I'm going to be talking about some case studies from our Candidate Experience Awards benchmark research program from this year. A couple of case studies from companies in the APAC region that I'm going to talk more about. My name is Kevin Grossman, the president of Talent Board and the Candidate Experience Awards. And we've been doing this research now for over 10 years. We've worked with hundreds of companies over the years, in fact, 1,200 plus overall, companies big and small across industries around the world that are benchmarking their candidate experience in our program. They are surveying their candidates, getting feedback, anonymous feedback. And we've surveyed 1.25 million and growing candidates to date over time. This is the scope of research from this year, from 2021. It's up from last year, but as you can imagine, it's down from the past 2 years globally. In fact, definitely the pandemic has taken its toll on recruiting and hiring, which we could, of course, I'm sure I'll talk about way too much. And we're hoping to move beyond that now, wherever you're at in the world, and especially in Australia for that matter, too, based on all the lockdowns that you've unfortunately had to experience. But this is a lot of good data still that we're going to be talking about, obviously focusing on the APAC region. So one of the things that we saw this year compared to previous years is that the last year with the pandemic, the great experience, the very positive sentiment from the candidates in our global research shot way up. And that's not something that we were expecting to see last year. And then it stayed flat in North America and EMEA this year, but then in APAC and Latin America, it continued to go up. What we know now in our research and our data is that usually only about 10-ish% of all the candidate responses every year and are those who were hired. This year in APAC, it was 32%, and in Latin America, it was 22%. So much higher skew than we usually see, which is definitely contributes to the positive skew. We also know, not so much in the Australian, New Zealand markets, but we know elsewhere in other countries in APAC as well as Latin America that candidates are less likely to share negative feedback based on their experience, which also adds to that positive skew. But that's what we saw. When you look at the other side of that same question that we ask about, again, how likely are you to change your relationship with us, the employer, going forward? This is what we call the resentment rate. And in North America, we're definitely back to pre-COVID resentment levels. And North America has always been the highest resentment levels that we've seen over the years. EMEA was starting to climb back up again. And then based on what I've already shared, it stayed flat in APAC and Latin America as well. And this is one of 4 key ratings questions that we ask the candidates every year. In fact, here are those 4 key rating questions around the world in each of our regions last year and this year, comparing and showing you what, again, the general direction things have gone since last year. They've gone down in EMEA and APAC. These are our key ratings that we ask converted to Net Promoter Score, which is what we do. They're 4 and 5 point scales, which are easily converted to Net Promoter. You can see the slide in North America and EMEA, but in Latin America and APAC, they've actually gone up and have been more positive. Our Net Promoter Scores are inherently lower every year because the majority of candidates, even in regions like APAC this year that skewed more positive, but the majority of candidates don't get hired. So there is a negative slant, a negative sentiment that's in the foundation that will always be there no matter what you do. And most companies will only see NPS scores, Net Promoter Scores, in the 50s and above for the people who got hired. So the new hires is where we see that in the ratings. That gives you an idea of what we saw. And no matter what, there's always something that's impacting the business every single year. Obviously, the pandemic has impacted businesses globally the past 2 years, but there could be leadership changes on your team. There could be recruiting team changes. Maybe you're part of a merger acquisition activity. The list goes on. New products and services, all of these things impact recruiting and hiring, and then in turn impact the business, of course. And we know in a downturn, unfortunately, in a downturn, recruiting takes the hit. And when there's an upturn, recruiting is the first to come back. And that's what we're seeing now in a lot of places around the world, is kind of this frenetic ramping and hiring. My hair is on fire hiring kind of scenario with employees quitting in record numbers. in tight labor markets and many different markets around the world as well, is what we've been seeing. But the reality for most candidates at the end of the day is they research your company, they apply for a job, and that's the end of the road. That's it. They get rejected. It's mostly an automated process. It's a very limited experience for most candidates. And it's always a much smaller group that gets screened, interviewed, assessed, and then made offers to and hired. That is the reality at the end of the day. And most employers, for any hiring volume, you do control the dial still of what's being told to candidates and when it's being told to them, i.e. when they're being rejected, et cetera. And you can control the communications and what you're saying. But again, very limited for a majority of people who are not going to get very far at the end of the day. But no matter what the world looks like, these continue to be the key differentiators that we see every single year in our research. Communication differentiators, expectation setting, feedback, not only asking for feedback, but providing feedback, especially to final stage candidates, which is something the highest CandE winners in every region in our data every year are always doing more of these things, more of the time, more consistently over time, which is not easy to do for many companies because of the same business impacts that I was just talking about. All of these things translate into a higher level of perceived fairness for the candidates at the end of the day. And that's key, because if they feel it's more positive and they feel it was fair, they are more likely to apply again in the future, to refer others again in the future. And if you're a consumer-based business in particular, to be a consumer, to be a customer of yours, to stay a customer, and to have brand affinity just in general, whether you're B2B or B2C. So those are the things that we see every year that we differentiate, that differentiates our research. So these are going to be the two brief examples I'm going to be sharing with you over the next few minutes of this session. Of Komatsu and Flex are two of the APAC CandE winners this year in our data. And Komatsu being a construction company, and then Flex being a manufacturing company. And what we see every year in our data is companies who have the highest positive candidate ratings for the majority of people who aren't hired is how we run our calculations every year. It's what we call our CandE score, which is for internal ranking, but it is always weighted more heavily on those who don't get hired, because we're accounting for the halo effect of those who do. And there's always a positive skew that we see. So these are the two organizations that we're going to talk about, just a few things of what they're doing that I'm sure hopefully many of you are doing as well in your organizations on a regular basis for recruiting, hiring, retention, and of course, improving the candidate experience at the end of the day. So just to give you some examples of some of the things that they're proud of this year. If you take a look at some of these bullets, I mean, when we hear the themes of, the candidate is our primary customer in recruiting, they are the heart of everything that we do, create and design and recruiting and hiring, and our branding tactics, recruitment, marketing, the list goes on. That's a common theme that we hear and see across all CandE winners globally. And again, this no exception from Komatsu. And these are actually excerpts from case studies that they did with us this year that we're sharing from you. So this is fresh from their insights of what they did and what they're proud of and how it impacted their recruiting and hiring. Technology is a big part of recruiting and hiring. You all know that. And you've got some, great tech companies that are in the Australia, New Zealand markets as well. And Komatsu, does some really good timely outreach. They use Live Hire as their talent community, and talent communities as a way to being able to continue to communicate with candidates, not just sending them jobs, but hopefully sharing industry information, sharing more about the company to keep them excited and warm about wanting to potentially work there someday, especially if they didn't make the cut, which most won't for any given job. And then technology also impacted Flex. I mean, they use Workday to improve their candidate experience, which and timely dispositions. This is a really important one. It's something that we talk a lot about at Talent Board, that anytime an organization waits till the rec is filled to then disposition, i.e. reject all the candidates for that particular rec or that job, that's not really what we would call a proven practice, a positive proven practice, because the longer the time's always a factor. And for the majority of candidates who aren't qualified and aren't going to go very far, that timely disposition, preferably within 1 to 2 weeks, actually, is what we recommend, is always the best. If they're not qualified and they're not going to go any farther, then let them know and move on and focus on the people who you are screening and interviewing at the end of the day, and really try to, get that embedded in your recruiting culture as well as with your hiring managers, which I know isn't always easy to do. Flex also has their own talent community that they had launched through their external careers site. And then 2 proud programs that they're proud of, or 2 programs that they're very proud of: their global employee referral program, if referrals are always key, and their internal mobility, what they call Flex Elevate program. And that's another important thing too, because again, retention is very top of mind for a lot of your organizations, or around the world for that matter. And with employees leaving, if attrition's high at your organization, it makes it that much harder on the recruiting and hiring side. Also about referrals, one of the things to keep in mind, every year in our data, most of the about 30% of all the candidate responses say that they're still extremely likely to refer others, and most of the candidates in our data don't get hired. So think about that for a minute when you're thinking about, if you've never thought about rejected candidates as a potential referral pool, it's possible. It's definitely possible if they feel it was, again, fair and positive in their overall experience. And then we talk about, how did you inform those changes within the organization? What did you do before you made any of these changes that you did in your organization? And how did you convince, get the internal champions to participate, whether that's leadership, your own teams, hiring managers? Komatsu, they leverage an RPO solution, and they held several sessions with key stakeholders in the business to understand better overall. And I'm sure some of you have done this in your own organizations, identifying areas of improvement, right? And feedback sessions are always important. And so it's beyond, getting survey feedback is one thing, but actually doing focus groups is another, and not just with candidates and employees, but also with your recruiting team, with your hiring managers. Doing an audit is actually a really good idea, and interviewing a group of internal folks about what works and what doesn't from their perspective to inform improvements that you may want to make. And also looking at your recruiting metrics, of course, is extremely important. And Komatsu did a lot of that when they were, again, looking at what is it that we need to improve in our recruiting, hiring, and how that impacts candidate experience. The same with Flex. And Flex, they also definitely dove heavily into the CandE data and our benchmark research, because they've participated in the past as well, and really leveraging that data. And again, across all the ratings, the key ratings that we already talked about in this session, as well as what we call the journey ratings. So companies who do the longer survey with us and their candidates, they also get stage-based ratings from research all the way to onboarding. And that's all can help inform what kinds of improvements that you need to be made. And that's, of course, what these 2 companies have done. And then when we talk about measuring the candidate experience, what's related to that, how are you doing that on an ongoing basis, and asking them, Komatsu's reporting this on a number of different ways, right? So again, as I mentioned before, written and verbal feedback from the candidates directly. And if you have the bandwidth to do that, and unfortunately, we know that there's, recruiting teams with their hair on fire that don't have a lot of breathing room, but it's super important to give your teams breathing room to get that kind of a feedback. And then really stay connected with the hiring managers at your organizations, get them bought into why you're doing what you're doing and how that improves the impact on the business over time, not just on certain candidates that you may or may not hire at the end of the day. That's super important. Flex, again, they're not just asking their candidates, they're asking their teams, their hiring managers. They're looking at the benchmark research data from the CandEs on an ongoing basis. They also have an internal group of recruiters they call Change Champions, who help to socialize a better candidate experience internally. One of the hardest things we see for companies every single year in our data and feedback is sustaining the experience over time. So if you have those embedded champions inside the organization that are constantly promoting quality experience, not just for external candidates, but for your own employees as well, for internal mobility opportunities for individuals that you're trying to retain, it all interconnects and impacts the business bottom line at the end of the day for your organization. So that's what I wanted to share with you. So just some quick hits. You'll be able to access those full case studies very soon, but by the end of the year, early next, as we launch the 2022 program, in our research reports that are being worked on now, so you can then review all the case studies around the world that we've captured. Those are just two examples that I wanted to share with you today from these two APAC winners. And this is another best practices chart that we've put together based on what we've learned over the past 10 plus years across the candidate journey, things that CandE winners, again, companies with higher positive candidate ratings every year in our research, that they're doubling down on. They're focusing more on consistently across the journey. That's process driven, that's technology driven, all of these things that interconnect. And that's something that I wanted to share with you. You can download this, by the way, from our website at thetalentboard.org. It's right on the website. It's a free PDF to download if you're interested in seeing that chart. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope that I gave you some brief insights based on two APAC CandE winners, Komatsu and Flex, and learned a little bit more about our program. And our benchmark research program will be open again and late in January for the 2022 program year. And there'll be more information on our site. And if you don't currently get our newsletters and updated information, you can sign up on our site as well for that. So I hope you all have a great Talent Table conference and event and in person. Raise a glass for me and hopefully I can be there in the near future with you all. So enjoy. Thanks again.